Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to my session. I had a bit of a delay here getting started. I had to do some shenanigans up here, so I think we're all set now. The gods of demo will be with me, I hope. So what I'm going to talk about here, if you look at the session in the agenda, it says what's coming in CMIS 1.1. Now, when I submitted the session, that was true. CMIS 1.1 had not yet been approved. But by the time the summit has come around, it's been approved, and as you'll see, Alfresco has done quite a bit to implement that specification. I'll be demonstrating some of those things and talking about them. So a little bit of ancient history. It's in my CMIS-centric world. This is 6,000 years before the CMIS era, and we had the confusion of tongues reigning in the world of ECM. So every time you wanted to access an ECM system, you would learn some new, arcane, as complicated as they can make it, protocol and API. Along comes CMS 1.1 in May 2010. And the key thing is that Alfresco led in the definition and the implementation of that standard. So some recent history is in the year 2 of CMIS era. If you went to the summit, what it was called the DevCon last year, you saw Peter Monks and Gethin James introducing the Alfresco API, which is an implementation of CMIS as well as sort of a brother of that, which is our RESTful API in Alfresco. And with that implementation, you could do a lot, but it was in the cloud. And it was in CMIS 1.0. Now, in the year 3 of CMIS, we have CMIS 1.1. And that's where I come in now today. Because with CMIS 1.1, we see the introduction of these 7, or actually more than 7 now, interesting capabilities that I'll be describing in some detail. Now, the interesting thing is, CMIS 1.1 came along back in the first half of this year, and along comes Alfresco 4.2 in the same year, and we shipped last week an implementation of CMIS 1.1. The interesting thing is we've implemented CMIS on-premise, and we've implemented what I think are the most important capabilities of CMIS 1.1, which are the browser binding. And by the way, the reason I think that's one of the reasons I think that's the most important is because I was the spec lead for that bit of CMIS, but I think I was the spec lead for CMIS because I thought it was the most important thing to begin with. So the browser binding's there, and I'll show you a lot about that. A good part of this session is going to be about that browser binding. I know Ian, who had done the session here before me, was talking about XML and all the things you could do with XML. And I like XML. I've done some of the things he was talking about with XSLT and XForms. I'm not against XML, but with the browser binding, we get a lot more. We have secondary types, and I'll talk about what we've done there, because CMIS actually is a reflection of what Alfresco already implemented and the concepts that Alfresco had even before that around aspects. So you'll see that. And this, one of my personal favorites, which is append support, and I'll explain why I think that's important a little bit later. So we could do a drinking game here, which is every time I say the word easy in this session, somebody could take a drink if somebody brought a bottle of something. I think you're going to be pretty drunk when the session's over if you do that, if you follow that game, because I use that word a lot. A lot of what we're trying to do here with the introduction of CMIS 1.1 in Alfresco is around easy. Now, easy for web developers means really easy. Java developers have, I think, a higher tolerance for pain. And as you go back in time in the world of programming, you get higher and higher tolerances for pain. I started when we were card punching, and I would submit decks of cards and come back 3 days later to find out I had missed a syntax error. I had a syntax error. In the current world, web developers want to be able to turn things around within a few seconds in some cases. So they also want to be able to use what they already know. They're not against learning things, but they've already learned a lot, and they want to be able to use basic things like JavaScript and HTML, and they don't want to have to relearn that stuff. And one of the reasons they don't want to have to relearn that stuff is that the browser provides for them the vector, the user agent that's working on their behalf. And the browser has certain capabilities, and among those are the understanding of those technologies I just mentioned. They also have a limited vocabulary, not because web developers aren't smart people, but again, they have to reflect the vocabulary of the browser. The browser only knows how to do a couple things, get and post. Everything else you have to do is some funny JavaScript, and that's tough to get past. And finally, web developers like URLs that are simple and predictable. Now, I get the whole concept of discoverability. I get hypertext, I get hagios, or however they pronounce it. I understand it. But in the real world, you want to be able to construct URLs in advance on the client side of being able to work with the content. So we've done all those things with CMIS 1.1 with the browser binding. We've made referencing content easy, so you could take another drink now. And by easy, I mean that if you go to the service document in Alfresco, you'll get back, a CMS 1.1 repository, you'll get back two interesting URLs, a root folder URL and a repository URL. And with those two URLs, you could reference anything in the repository. So if you have a document and you know that document's ID is object ID, you could tack that on to the end of that URL and you get that object. If you have the path of the object, sites/foobar, whatever it is, you could tack that on to the end of the URL, the root folder URL, and you get back the object. Simple, predictable URLs. And we have content, if it's independent of folders, like type definitions, you could use the repository URL, tack a repository URL with a selector like type definitions, and you'll get back that content. So what I've tried to do here is introduce a few short demonstrations in the course of the presentation today, each of these capabilities. So you'll see this in a second. We've also added the CMS Selector thing. Now, again, people hate the idea of building verbs into URLs, but sometimes it comes in real handy to have a parameter that tells the repository what to do. And one of the things we have is this CMS Selector thing that tells you what you want to do on a resource. So if you're getting a folder, you could say to you could tell the repository whether you want to get that folder's children by putting a children selector on it, or you could say, I want to just get the object properties, or whatever. There's a number of selectors we build in. So let's see if I can get my demonstration here to work. So I'll go over to a browser. I promised that browsers were really important here. So now what I've implemented, I like Google Chrome extensions. I like developing in them because I only have a few minutes to do that kind of fun stuff. And it's possible with a few minutes of work to build a Chrome extension. So I have this little Chrome extension that, it's hard for you to see it here because of the resolution of the screen. Not sure how to get past that now. Let's try this one. Let's try this one. I have a CMIS file explorer. The screen is insisting on going over to the left-hand side here. So what I'm going to do is fetch that. And what came back were all the files in my local repository. So I'll show you a little bit of the magic code behind that. It's very, very simple. But remember that CMS root folder URL I mentioned? Well, what I do is I take that root folder URL, which is this folder I actually show here. See if I can make this any bigger. Well, it's awfully tough on this screen here to get anything good to happen. Let me try this. Try it again. And when I do that, when I go and do a get on that root folder URL, then I just take the paths I get of the folders in that directory and I recurse through and find all of the content in the repository. So let's look at what the code looks like behind this. So if I go to my File Explorer here. If I go into my JavaScript file, there it is. I'll try to expand this to give you a little more room here. And all I'm doing here in this little Chrome extension is when I'm sure the page is loaded, I go get that root folder URL, which is just that little thing I got in the page. And then I call list children, a JavaScript method on that. And if I look at the list children, all that does, and I won't go through this in detail, is just recurse through the paths that he finds. Now, I also have running behind the scenes Charles, which is a proxy that I really love. And if you look at that Charles proxy, you see all of the requests and responses coming through that I issued for those. So you can see the requests coming through. I'm looking for the SD in the site SWSDP data lists, the selector children. And if I look at the response, it's just some really simple JavaScript. And all I'm doing in that, maybe it's 30 lines of JavaScript, is just turning that into something I could see in the browser. So I'll minimize Charles for a second. I'll show you another one of those. This is a type explorer. Remember I mentioned that you can get information from the repository that's independent of the folder structure, things like type definitions. There's my CMIS repository URL, which is actually an instance of Alfresco running on this machine. And I do that, and I get all the types in the system. And I can look at one of those types and click on it and get some information about that type. So what kind of code is behind that? Let's look at that code for a little bit. It's all in this little JavaScript file here. And just as I had that JavaScript file that was sure it was loaded before for the File Explorer, I'm sure it's loaded here. And then I go up here and I just load the types by recursively going through the root folder, the repository URL, and looking at all the type definitions I'm getting back. And there's a little bit of, again, magic happening here because I'm using jQuery, which is kind of nice for doing things like hovering over a piece of text and showing a dialog when that's necessary. So I've got all that, and I did it with just a little bit of code. So we jump back to my presentation here. But there's more, right? So it wouldn't be very much good if all you could do is look at content in a repository. You want to be able to create content in a repository. Now, create updates and deletes use HTTP post. Now, there was a lot of controversy when we developed this specification about what we were going to do to allow CRUD operations. And there was a camp that said, let's make them use a JavaScript library or whatever. And myself and a couple other people advocated to, let's instead take advantage of the fact that browsers know how to post HTML forms. So let's pack everything we need into a form, and we'll use that as our vehicle to get content back and forth. So that's what we've done. We've taken a form definition, and just as we had the CMS Selector parameter before to tell the server what to do, we have a CMS action a control on the form that tells the Alfresco repository what to do when it receives this packet of information. Should it create a document? Should it update a document? What should it do with the information? And then we figured out a reasonably clever way to encode the CMS properties in the form. So we've got this idea that you could put a control on the form, just like you would any form, an input control, for example. And you could put the ID of that matching an ID elsewhere in the form that tells the repository what property it is that you're setting with that. And you would hide all that back-end stuff, the names of the properties from the user in the form, but they'd actually be in the form. So with that, you could build a form in 20 lines or less of HTML to create a document, actually less if you're more efficient than me. And the way it works, and I'll show you this in a second in another short demo, is you've got this input field for the name of the, show it here, for the name of the property that you're going to set. And it's the CMIS name property. And everything else is picked for you. The object ID, in my case, is a property for CMIS document, or the object type ID. And then I have another input element, which is where I select the body of the content. Because another thing that forms know how to do is upload files. So we wanted to take advantage of that. So let me see if I can get that to work here. So I'll go back to my little Eclipse environment here. And I have a couple of examples. Here they are. And I will open that with a web browser. Good. Now, I'm not very good at user interface design, as you can see. This is a very unsubtle form. It's got a giant green button. When you press it, it creates a document. But it kind of gets the point across. So let's create a document. I'll call it logo. I'll choose the file, and I'll choose one of my favorite files, the Alfresco logo. And now I'll hit the giant green button. And because I had to reboot my machine, I now have to log in again. And there it is, boom. Now, a little bit of ugliness here is I'm just regurgitating the exact response I get from the Alfresco server. In real life, you wouldn't do that. I thought it would be good here for illustration purposes. This is what you get back from the server. Typically, what you would do is redirect this and show some confirmation form, and there's examples of how to do stuff like that, and actually in the book that Jeff Potts has written to do that. But if you look at the, but for illustration purposes, this was enough. Now, if you look at the repository now, if I refresh this, go into Barcelona, hopefully. There it is. There's logo. I created it. And there's the logo I uploaded just now. So all I had to do, if you look at that form, if you look at if I open that in an HTML editor, you could see how exceedingly difficult this form is, or how easy this form is. It's, you have some input element here for the name, and you have that corresponding to a property ID with that same index value that tells it what CMIS property that is. And then you have some other information that carries along and extra metadata about that. This is the whole form. So this is all you need to do to create a document now in CMIS. Anybody with a text editor, anybody with VI or Notepad can create this form and run it on their laptop or Mac. Easy, very, very easy, right? So let's minimize that, go back to my presentation. Okay, so many promises of losing weight happen in the world. There's advertisements for losing weight. Well, one of the things that we hear about CMIS, as much as I love it, is that it's terribly overweight and difficult to work with in that respect. It's very, very chatty. Another analogy is it's kind of like that guy you meet at the party, ask him how he is, and he tells you his entire medical history, and you know, that's more information than you know how to deal with. Now, CMIS is a little bit like that. You go and get a document, and it regurgitates for you the document, but everything about the document, the property definitions and so on. Well, one of the things we know is, if you're working in the mobile world in particular, is that's really bad. So we wanted to make sure that we had a mechanism in CMS to assure you can get just the information you wanted. Now, there's filtering in CMS 1.0. That doesn't completely solve the problem. So what we did was we implemented a succinct parameter on get and post. And if you use that parameter, we will give you the tersest response we can, leaving out property definitions, and you get back, I promise, 87% fat-free results when you use this. So let me see if I could show you an example of that here. So I'll jump over to Chrome again. And well, you know what I'll do is unfortunately my apps is, there it is. Go to Postman. Okay, so here are my collections. You can see I do a lot with Postman, right? So, look at my collections. I have Summit and I have a FAT request. So I'll issue the FAT request. Now the FAT request is the one that doesn't have any succinct parameter on it. Look in there. And there it is. So lots and lots of data, right? You get the point. Now I'm going to issue the skinny request. And the only difference between the FAT request and the skinny request is that succinct parameter. That's it. 87% fat-free. So we squeezed 18,000 bytes or whatever it was into 3,000 bytes. Very much easier, especially if you're in a mobile world. Now, another thing that we struggled with CMIS 1.1 was how do we help the browser user overcome the problem of crossing borders. Now, browsers enforce the same origin policy, which says that you shouldn't be able to execute JavaScript from a different source than the thing that served you the page. And it's done for good reasons. But there are some cases where you want to bend that rule, where, for example, you might have the CMIS repository on one server you control and the application on the other one. So there might be some reasons why you need to get around that policy. And we wanted to make that easy to do. Now, there is a way to do that in the world of HTTP, in HTML, it's with JSON-P, JSON with padding. JSON with padding essentially says if you go to the server and get a piece of information, you could pass the server the name of a function. The server doesn't know it's a function, but it's a JavaScript function. And what it will do is it will answer back the results as essentially a function call with whatever it wants to stick in as a parameter into that function call. So what we did was we added into CMIS 1.1 a callback parameter. And with that callback parameter, you could pass in something to CMIS now, and you'll get back results. So now the long-term answer, I don't pretend this is the strategic answer. The long-term answer is cores, and you can see Jared there. I work a lot with Jared. Jared's implemented cores, and that's some of how we implemented the Salesforce connector in Alfresco. But for now, this is pretty good. This makes things quite a bit easier. So let me show you an example of that. Again, I like to show you examples here. First of all, let's go into my my browser. Do I have connectivity here? Yeah, I think I do. Let's make sure, because that'll be important. All right, foo. It's always good to get to foo. So the first thing I'll show you is this JSON-P example, and I will open it with a web browser. And what it gives you back is repository information. Not that interesting, right? But what's interesting is how I built this page. Inside of this page, all I'm doing is I have a JavaScript function that knows how to build this table, and I'm going and I'm passing the name of that function to Alfresco. It's answering me back a JavaScript object inside of a call to that function. So if I look at the HTML for that, I could see this is my document that understands how to get back the information it gets back from Alfresco. And all I'm doing when I get the information is passing that as a callback parameter into the repository. So that callback parameter just instructs Alfresco to return that in a certain format. So this to actually prove that this is doing something real. Let me show this again. I'll open it with a web browser. Except this time, I'll choose a server that you know, well, you'll have to trust me a little bit, I guess, doesn't have Alfresco running on it and isn't where this document's being served from. So I'll type in Melahn.com. And there it is. So what I pass to Melahn.com, which is just this dumb web server I have, is that same information. I say, go get me it will have the ability to get this page and then go to Alfresco to get the content. Now, here I've got JavaScript being executed with content coming from a different source. It's a lot easier to do that, to answer some simple cases of crossing boundaries in in the real world. Now, if you're concerned about security, there's good reasons to be concerned about security when it comes to cross-site operations like that. But if you're sure of the origins of the content, the JavaScript and the content, it will save you a lot of work. So let me go back to, now we get into some even more interesting things. Adding aspects is easy. In Alfresco in CMIS 1.0, we introduced a great API, but it didn't have any concept of aspects. In 1.1, because we sort of insisted on it, it includes something called secondary types. And what we've done in Alfresco is mapped secondary types to Alfresco aspects. Now, what these secondary types allow you to do is to mix in properties into an existing object. So you can go to an object and add in EXIF data or add in Dublin core data at will by just adding to a CMIS secondary object type property the type definition ID of that type you want to add. So again, let me show you an example. So I'll go to my Eclipse and I'll say open with web browser. Another one of my famous unsubtle interfaces here, right? A big orange button. So I have a document that I'm going to attach some attributes to. So let's go to the document here in Alfresco. And here it is. I tried to pick something that was sort of synonymous with Barcelona. I think that's one of the landmarks around here. If I go to Manage Aspects, he doesn't have any, he has versionable, but that's all he's got. He doesn't even have EXIF added to him. So I can cancel that. And what I'll do now is inside of here, I'll pick EXIF, and I'll pick summarizable. Boom. So what's happened is I've taken the type definitions for those two things, I've packed them into that object types identifier array and multi-value property and sent that up to Alfresco. So that's all I had to do. And if you go back to here, if all worked out well, there you see it. EXIF data is now present as a type, and so is summarizable. So I'll be happy, I'll leave that alone. And if I refresh this, I should even see the EXIF data appearing here. Of course, there's not any content yet. Now, I could have been more fancy and put the content in there, which is what you would do in a real case. But I wanted to show you how easy it is to add or subtract aspects. And when you add an aspect, you would usually add the values for the properties as well at the same time. So let's go back. Pretty easy to add aspects now. There's a lot you can do with that. You could find out what aspects have been added to a document by going and getting this property and looking at the content of it. So pretty good stuff. Now, appending content is easy as well. Sometimes you want to load content in one giant chunk, but sometimes you can't because the nature of the content might be incremental. It might be a drip model. And you don't want to download the whole thing to add 20 lines to the bottom and upload the whole thing. You just want to increment it. You want to add stuff to the tail. A journal or diary is kind of like that. Another thing you have is for giant files. Now, before I joined Alfresco a year ago, I worked for IBM. And the last product I built at IBM was this thing called Managed File Transfer. And we had to send bank reconciliation data. And sometimes these are 20 gigabyte files that absolutely have to get there in one piece. And it was really tough to do that with FTP and a number of other technologies. So we built something that helps with that. And we saw the need for this append parameter, and we introduced it into the spec. And now I get to use it in Alfresco, which is even better. And it allows me to overcome a number of limits, file size limits, bad connection limits, and so on. Now this is a little bit tricky here. I'm going to show you, one more thing. There's an isLastChunk parameter that's optional. If you send that parameter on the request, what it will do is it will tell the server, I'm done. You can go do what you normally do, finalizing the content. Maybe you want to version it or add a comment to it or something like that. So now this is a little tricky, this demo, but I will do my best. I will show you how you can construct a simple diary using some speech technology from Google. So here it is. Now, the only thing that's a little odd about this is that because of the state of this API at the moment, so this isn't for production purposes, right? The state of this API at the moment is it would require me to disable Chrome security in order for this to work. Now, I'll do that. You wouldn't normally do that here, but before I do that, I'll actually quit Chrome. There it is. And I will open this file here. This is all the hazards of live code, right? Okay, another one of my not very fancy interfaces here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak into the microphone here, and if all goes well, what I'll get is a CMIS append request happening to my local Alfresco repository. So I'll press this mic. Welcome to Barcelona. Welcome to Barcelona. So if I go to my Alfresco repository now, and I go to share, and I log in, I go to my document library in Barcelona. I see this diary text file here. So if I go in there and I maximize it, you'll get to see, welcome to Barcelona. So I probably could have asked you to come up with some words to make sure I didn't fudge and fabricate this whole thing. But that's what happened. All I did was I spoke into the microphone, it turned it in, it took that little speech-to-text thing from Google, stuck it on an append, using this append parameter, and added it to this diary I'm keeping of my journey to Barcelona. So that's pretty easy stuff, right? Really easy stuff. So you can see advantages to ways of using that, I hope. It's pretty neat. So we jump back into my presentation, and I think actually I have more presentation material here, but that will be the end of the demonstration pieces of this anyway. So if you let me come back to my session here. There's a number of other things that are inside of CMIS I wanted to talk about. Now, these are not things that we've all yet implemented in Alfresco, but I wanted to mention them nonetheless because there are things that we're going to continue to work on. First of all, I'd mention that the schema behind this is easy. So take another drink. We base it on something called orderly. We were able to get the permission from the author of orderly. He's come up with a much simpler schema for JSON than JSON schema. It's human readable. It's actually pretty good. We chose it. We got his permission, and we used that because you could actually read this as a human being. You could read this schema. Now, there's other things added to the spec. One of the things is something called bulk update. It's really handy at times to want to broadcast a set of changes to a bunch of files. The way you could do that now, for example, you want to add aspects to a bunch of files. Maybe you want to add a description to a set of folders. You can do that now by having taking advantage of a new property called object and change token, which is a multi-value property of object IDs. And you could pass it a property bag and say, all those objects, apply all those properties to it. Or add or subtract all those aspects to it. You can do that with this call. Now, we don't have this implemented yet in Alfresco 4.2. But again, one of the things that's in our sites. Now, type mutability. We all know about mutations. Most of the time they're bad, but sometimes they're good. Sometimes you want to be able to change a type definition on the fly. So introduced in CMIS 1.1 was a proper mechanism to do that. And it's very easy to do because all it does is it takes the same principles in CMIS 1.0 of CRUD operations by posting to collections. And we've applied that same principle to type definitions. So I can post, to create a new type, I could post a new type to the types collection. Or if I want to delete it, I can remove it. Whether you can do this or not, you can signal as a repository by having these capabilities as part of your repository information. We don't yet implement this in Alfresco 4.2. Again, something in our sites. Now, item. Again, one of my IBM things. Before I joined Alfresco, this product I built had the need, I loved CMIS, I used it everywhere I could, but we had the need to create people in this product as well, because we were allowing people to send files to each other and they had to register themselves, so we needed to dynamically create people on the fly. And I thought about, well, I could just define them as CMIS documents, but that seemed so unnatural, I didn't do it. I invented my own API, I'm afraid to say. But now, with CMIS item, which is a generic type introduced with 1.1, I could use CMIS to model things that aren't documents, aren't folders, aren't policies or relationships. I could have used that API to create people. So this is a great way to create a model in CMIS where you want to store people, places, things, animals, vegetables, minerals, or whatever. So you do that by instantiating instances of this new type, and you subtype this CMIS item type to have flavors like people or whatever it is that you're trying to create an instance of. Whether you support this or not, a repository signals by including that or not in its type list. So we don't support this yet in Alfresco 4.2, but something for the future. Now, repository features. There's a lot of things that CMIS does, but there's a lot it doesn't do. It doesn't do workflow, doesn't do records management, and so on, all those important things. A way for repositories to signal what they can or can't do, so as an assist to your application, can be encoded now in another array that you can optionally add to your repository information in CMIS. So this is the repository features capability. So if you look at the repository features, all it is an extended features element and a bunch of array elements that describe what it is that you as a repository support that maybe other repositories don't support, so that clients can intelligently act on the results. Now, there's another feature in CMIS 1.1 called retention and hold. Now, I'm not a particular fan of this feature, I'll admit, but I could see why the business needs there for it. I'm just not sure it belongs in the CMIS standard, but it is in the standard at the moment. And what this allows you to do is define this principle called a retention and a hold. Now, these are all ways for you to assure that people in your company or government or organization don't delete things or modify things they shouldn't delete or modify. So a politician can't go in and just pretend something didn't happen by erasing all the documents. If you've got a retention defined on that document and a hold has been placed on that document. So a retention says, this document needs to be kept for this many years, and a hold says, this document is being protected. So there's some capabilities that you'll get through this records management retention thing, but that's something that CMIS 1.1 as well. Now, this is more for reference purposes. I put the CMIS endpoints on here, so you have a color-coded list of what the endpoints look like. And I followed the color coding pattern that Peter Monks and Gethin James used last year at the DevCon because it's pretty and it's informative. So you could use that as your guide. If you install CMIS 4.2.d, the Community Edition, or E, Community Edition, or buy Alfresco 4.2, you could use these endpoints now to work with CMIS 1.1. So in summary, try to leave 5 minutes for questions. In summary, Alfresco 4.2 adds support for CMIS on-premise. Furthermore, it's CMIS 1.1 on-premise, which adds important new features like the browser binding, which you probably realize by now I really like, secondary types, which is aspects, and this appending content thing, which is the speech-to-text example I gave. And with that, I'll just put this confused guy up to indicate that it's time for questions. So if anybody, yes, question. I'll try to listen.
Well, these guys want me to have a microphone, so.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so my question is about the binding URLs. Is there any plan to have some default binding URL that doesn't include any network? I mean, I'm working on the LibreOffice integration on that. And most of the time users don't know it. And if I could discover the networks which are just repositories and have a URL without that repository ID inside, that would help just discoverability.
So are you looking for an API to find the repositories or the networks within a repository?
Well, are repositories and networks the same? That's first question.
Yeah. Well, CMIS doesn't have a plan, doesn't have that concept. You could model it as something in CMIS and we could answer it back. We do have the other API, that brother API I mentioned, the REST API. So that's likely, if we were going to do anything with that, we could add it there to get a list of networks. One thing you could do, which I thought about in the past, is to have a repository of repositories. So it would be kind of handy to have a repository in which all you stored were repository info files as a flat list. And you can go query that, and then that gave you the information you could use to go off and query that thing, which is described by the, so it's an index essentially. But those are the only two thoughts I have on it, on getting that answer to your question.
Okay, and the other question I had is about the CMS web page that is shipped by default. It provides the links to the binding URLs, but these are still the 1.0. So is there any plan to update these to 1.1?
Yeah, we're gonna update that external page. It's overdue to make it to put the 1.1 URLs up there. Now, cloud doesn't yet have. We haven't deployed this to the cloud, so we might wait until we have that piece there before we update it. But yeah, we'll do a better job with that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I'll go to your session. Is it tomorrow on LibreOffice? Yeah, sounds really good. Other questions? Everybody wants to get to the keynote now, I think, maybe? Okay. Well, I'm going to be here all week, so if you have any questions later, just come around and I'll be glad to chat with you. Thank you very much.